She was pure and asked him to be careful that first night, but what he did left her completely speechless. No one expected that gesture. Where are you watching this story from? Subscribe to the channel and leave a like, because what happened next will truly move you. The glass and steel skyscraper rose like a modern fortress in the heart of Manhattan, its windows reflecting a sky that was beginning to turn orange. On the 30th floor, Emily Parker felt her heart beating so hard it could break through the walls of that elegant meeting room. Her hands, small and with nails bitten from the anxiety of recent weeks, trembled over the paper before her. A marriage contract. Sometimes the most unexpected paths are the ones that lead us exactly where we need to be, even if we never imagined taking that direction, she thought as the pen between her fingers hesitated over the signature line. At 23, Emily had never imagined she would find herself in this situation, about to marry a complete stranger, a powerful 41-year-old businessman whose name regularly appeared in financial magazines and whose fortune could solve all her problems in the blink of an eye. Michael Anderson, seated across from her at the polished mahogany table, observed her with an indecipherable expression in his dark eyes. There was no warmth in that gaze, only calculation. "Miss Parker," the lawyer spoke, breaking the tense silence, "do you need more time to review the terms?" Emily looked up from the document. She thought of her father, lying in a public hospital bed, urgently needing a transplant that cost more than she would earn in 10 years working as a waitress. She thought of the accumulated debts, the sleepless nights, the desperation that had brought her to this moment. "No," she answered with a voice firmer than she expected. "The terms are clear." Michael leaned slightly forward. He was an imposing man with black hair just sprinkled with grey at the temples and a tailored suit that probably cost more than the annual rent of the small apartment where Emily had grown up in Brooklyn. "Are you sure?" he asked, and for an instant Emily thought she detected something like concern in his voice. "A year is a long time to pretend." Emily held his gaze. In those dark brown eyes was something more than business coldness, something she couldn't quite decipher yet. An ancient sadness, perhaps, as if he carried wounds that all his money couldn't heal. "To save my father," she replied softly. "A year is nothing." And then, with a determination she didn't know she possessed, she signed the contract. A marriage of convenience for exactly 12 months. All her father's medical bills paid, access to the best specialists, and at the end of the year a substantial amount that would allow her to rebuild her life. In exchange, she would be the perfect wife in New York society, the ideal companion for events, the necessary facade for a man whose business reputation needed to be stabilized with a family image. What neither of them knew at that moment, as Emily's pen traced the last letter of her signature, was that contracts of hearts rarely follow what's written. The small chapel near Central Park gleamed with light filtering through the stained glass windows, creating a mosaic of colors on the stone floor. Emily looked at her hands covered in delicate lace gloves she hadn't chosen, just like the designer wedding dress she wore. A perfect dress for a bride who didn't feel like one. The priest spoke in a monotonous voice about commitment, fidelity, and eternal love, words that echoed off the chapel walls like cruel mockeries. Beside her, Michael remained erect and distant, like a statue carved in marble. He wore a charcoal grey suit that accentuated the width of his shoulders and the aristocratic bearing that seemed to run in his blood. Throughout the ceremony, he barely looked at her. Emily felt the curious glances from the few guests. His family, mainly. A mother with a regal bearing and evaluating gaze, a younger brother with a sardonic smile, some cousins and uncles who murmured among themselves. On her side, only her mother, Susan, a woman prematurely aged by worries, who observed everything with a mixture of incredulity and desperate hope. There are moments when our lives change forever, forks in the road where what we choose defines who we will be. But what if the choice was never really ours? Emily reflected as the priest asked for the rings. Michael's hands, surprisingly warm, brushed against hers as he placed the ring on her finger. A fleeting touch, almost imperceptible, but one that sent an electric current through her entire body. For an instant their eyes met, and Emily thought she saw something beyond business indifference, a vulnerability so brief she might have imagined it. "I, Michael Anderson, take you, Emily Parker, as my lawfully wedded wife," he recited in a deep, controlled voice like someone signing just another contract. When it was her turn, Her voice came out as a trembling whisper that seemed to get lost among the swirls of incense floating in the sacred air. The ceremony ended with a chaste kiss, barely a brush of lips that to any observer would have seemed shy, even romantic. No one could suspect it was the first real contact between them, the seal of a business agreement disguised as a sacrament. The small banquet was held at an exclusive restaurant in the Upper East Side. Linen tablecloths, crystal glassware that tinkled like silver bells, waiters who moved like discreet ghosts between the tables. Emily felt out of place, like an amateur actress in a play for which she hadn't rehearsed enough. It was then that the first surprise came. "Now," Michael announced, rising with glass in hand, "I'd like to offer a special dish for the bride." The waiters entered with steaming trays, and the unmistakable aroma of Thanksgiving dinner filled the room. Emily looked up, genuinely surprised. It was her favorite meal, the one her grandmother prepared each November in the small kitchen of the house in Virginia, where she spent the summers of her childhood. A homey, traditional meal that clashed completely with the sophistication of the place. "How did you know?" she murmured, confused. Michael leaned slightly, speaking only to her. "You mentioned it in our only conversation, 3 weeks ago. You said it reminded you of your childhood." Emily felt something strange in her chest, an unexpected warmth. He had listened. In the middle of that cold meeting where they had discussed the terms of the contract, he had paid attention to such a personal and insignificant detail. Why? The evening progressed in a haze of superficial conversations and practiced smiles. When finally the last guest departed, Emily felt the weight of fatigue and uncertainty on her shoulders. Now would come the most difficult part, sharing her life, her space, with a complete stranger. Michael's penthouse occupied the top floor of an ultra-modern building with views of the Manhattan skyline. When Emily crossed the threshold, she felt she was entering another world. Minimalist spaces bathed in the artificial light of the city, designer furniture that seemed more like sculptures than functional objects, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view where the lights of Fifth Avenue twinkled like fallen stars, and the silhouette of Central Park stretched majestically against the night sky. "Be careful what you wish for," her mother had said when saying goodbye, squeezing her hands tightly. "Some castles are just pretty cages." Michael left his keys on a marble table and loosened his tie with a tired gesture. Emily remained standing in the middle of the living room, not knowing what to do or where to place herself in that space that seemed taken from an architecture magazine. "You must be exhausted," he said, breaking the silence. "I'll show you to your room." Her room. Emily followed Michael down a hallway, trying to assimilate what that meant. He stopped in front of a door and opened it, revealing a spacious bedroom decorated in soft shades of terracotta and blue, with a large bed covered in linen sheets that looked like clouds, and a private balcony with a view of the city. "This will be your space," he explained, his voice deep but surprisingly gentle. "I've had it prepared with everything you might need, but if anything is missing, just let me know." Emily entered cautiously, touching the edge of the bed as if afraid it might disappear. It was more luxurious than any place she had ever slept. "Aren't we supposed to—" she began, not knowing how to formulate the question burning in her throat. Michael looked at her directly, for the first time all day, with an intensity that left her breathless. "I didn't come to this marriage expecting anything more than a business partner," he said firmly. "You have my word that you will be treated with all the respect you deserve. Our agreement doesn't include sharing a bed." Something in Emily's chest loosened, a knot of tension she didn't know she was holding. Gratitude must have shown on her face, because Michael nodded slightly, as if answering an unasked question. "There's something else," he added, taking an envelope from the inner pocket of his jacket. "An addition to the contract you signed." Emily took it with trembling fingers, fearing some new clause, some trap. What she found inside left her speechless. A document guaranteeing that at the end of the year, in addition to all her father's medical bills, she would receive a sum that would allow her to complete a degree in education at Columbia University. "How did you know I wanted to study education?" she whispered, astonished. A fleeting smile, the first she had seen on his face, crossed Michael's lips. "You mentioned it in that conversation. You said you always wanted to work with children, but had to drop out of school when your father got sick." Emily felt the floor moving beneath her feet. This man, this stranger she had just married, had paid more attention to her words in a brief conversation than many people who claim to have known her all her life. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, disconcerted. Michael headed toward the door, pausing a moment before leaving. "Because business works better when both parties get what they truly want," he responded pragmatically. But there was something more in his gaze, something that didn't match the coldness of his words. "Rest, Emily. Tomorrow will be a new day." When the door closed, Emily sat on the edge of the bed, holding that document that represented the dream she had been forced to abandon. Tears began to roll down her cheeks, tears of confusion, relief, fearful hope. Sometimes, she thought as she watched the lights of New York twinkle like distant promises, the cage isn't as narrow as we feared, and perhaps, just perhaps, it has a door we hadn't seen. The first rays of dawn were streaming through the slats of the blinds when Emily heard movement in the hallway. She sat up, disoriented for a moment in that unfamiliar room, until memories of the previous day came rushing back like an avalanche. She had gotten married. She was in Michael Anderson's penthouse. Her husband. The word sounded strange even in her thoughts. She put on a robe over her pajamas and ventured out. She found Michael in the kitchen, dressed in workout clothes, preparing coffee in a machine that looked like it came from a scientist's laboratory. The rising sun outlined his profile, softening the features that yesterday had seemed so severe. "Good morning," he said, noticing her. "Did I wake you?" "No, I'm not used to the bed. It's too—" Emily searched for the word soft. A fleeting smile crossed Michael's face. "I can have it changed for a firmer one." "No, no, please, it's perfect. I just need to get used to it." An awkward silence ensued as Michael served 2 cups of coffee. He offered one to Emily, who took it gratefully, again surprised by these small gestures of consideration that didn't match the image of the cold businessman. "Do you always wake up so early?" she asked, looking for something to break the ice. "Yes," he answered simply, but after a moment added, "I don't sleep much." Emily nodded, not knowing what else to say. In the morning light, the situation seemed even more surreal. "I've prepared the details of the private clinic where they'll transfer your father today," he commented, changing the subject. "Dr. Wilkins is the best transplant specialist in America. He'll be in good hands." Gratitude knotted in Emily's throat. This was the reason for everything, the reason she had signed that marriage contract, to save her father. "Thank you," she managed to say. "It means everything to me." Michael nodded slightly, as if the gratitude made him uncomfortable. "I have an early meeting today," he said, leaving his cup in the sink. "Mrs. Jones, the housekeeper, will come at 10. She can show you the rest of the apartment and help you with whatever you need." And so began the strange dance of 2 strangers learning to coexist under the same roof. The first days were an exercise in cautious, mutual observation. Emily discovered small details about Michael, that he had a meticulously established routine, that he drank green tea in the afternoons while reviewing documents, that he had an impressive library, but the poetry books were more worn than the economics ones. Michael, for his part, began to notice the subtle changes Emily brought to the space. The smell of cinnamon when she baked cookies in the kitchen he had never used, the fresh flowers that appeared in the center of the table every few days, the soft classical music that played in the afternoons. One night, almost 2 weeks after the wedding, Emily woke up startled by a noise. Following the dim light coming from the living room, she found Michael sitting on the sofa, an open and forgotten book on his lap, contemplating the sleeping city through the windows. "You can't sleep either?" she asked softly. He turned, surprised by her presence. "Nightmares," he replied with an honesty that seemed to surprise even himself. "I've had them for years." Emily approached cautiously and sat on the other end of the sofa. "My grandmother used to say that nightmares are fears we haven't faced during the day that chase us at night." Michael looked at her curiously. "Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman." "She was," Emily smiled with nostalgia. "She died when I was 15, but she left me many of her teachings. For the first time they really talked. Not about the contract, not about appearances, but about memories, about Emily's childhood in Virginia, about summers picking berries with her grandmother." Michael listened with genuine interest, as if each word were a piece of a puzzle he was trying to solve. When the sky began to lighten, Emily realized they had been talking for hours. "You should try to sleep a little more," he said, with a softness that contrasted with his usual tone of command. "Tomorrow we'll visit your father at the clinic." "We will?" she asked, surprised. I thought you would be busy with work." "I will be," Michael replied, standing up, "but I can make an exception." As she returned to her room, Emily felt a strange warmth spreading through her chest. Perhaps, she thought, contracts can't really define what happens between two people when they share not just a space, but fragments of their lives. What she didn't know was that night, for the first time in a long time, Michael would sleep without nightmares. The call that changed the dynamic between them came a month later. It was dinner time, one of those rare moments when they coincided in the penthouse. Emily had prepared a Thanksgiving-style turkey, remembering that Michael had mentioned how much he enjoyed home-style cooking, despite frequenting the most exclusive restaurants for business reasons. The phone rang insistently. Michael answered, and his expression transformed into a mask of tension. "We'll be there in half an hour," he said tersely before hanging up. "What happened?" Emily asked, alarmed by the sudden paleness of his face. "My mother is organizing a family dinner. She just returned from Paris and wants to officially meet you," he replied, passing a hand through his hair in an unusual gesture of nervousness. "We need to go now." The restaurant near Central Park was a discreet but unequivocally exclusive establishment, with a Michelin star and clientele that included the New York elite. Michael helped Emily out of the car, his hand on the small of her back, a gesture that to any observer would seem intimate, but that she knew was part of the act. However, as they approached the table where the Anderson family waited, Michael's hand tensed slightly, as if unconsciously seeking to give her courage. Or perhaps, thought Emily, it was he who needed it. Mrs. Eleanor Anderson was a 60-year-old woman who looked 10 years younger, with perfectly styled silver hair and a pearl necklace that gleamed under the dim lights of the restaurant. Her gaze pierced through Emily like a cold scalpel, evaluating her from head to toe. "So this is your wife," she said, pronouncing the last word as if it were a foreign and unpleasant term. "Michael, always so full of surprises." The introductions continued. James, Michael's younger brother, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Aunt Margaret with her fan that never stopped moving like the wings of a nervous bird. Uncle Ernest, whose congested face evidenced his fondness for good wine. The dinner was an endless parade of exquisite dishes that Emily barely tasted, too aware of the tension that saturated the environment. The conversation flowed superficially, but each comment from Mrs. Anderson seemed to have a double edge. "And tell me, dear," she asked with false sweetness, as the waiters served the second course, "at which university did you study? I've always thought that education is so revealing." "Actually, I had to leave school when my father got sick," Emily replied honestly, though she noticed how Michael tensed beside her. "But I plan to resume soon at Columbia." "Oh, how brave of you," Mrs. Anderson smiled. "Class differences are so interesting, aren't they? I've always been fascinated by how some people see opportunities in unexpected situations." The silence that followed was cutting. Emily felt the air solidifying in her lungs, humiliation burning in her cheeks. Was it so transparent to this woman that their marriage was a convenient arrangement? It was then that something unexpected happened. Michael, always controlled, always diplomatic, set his cutlery down on his plate with a clink that seemed to resonate throughout the restaurant. "Mother," he said in a voice so calm it was more intimidating than a shout, "let me clarify something. Emily is my wife. Not my partner, not my employee, but the woman I have chosen as my companion. If anyone at this table is unable to show her the respect she deserves, I'm afraid they won't be welcome in our lives." The declaration fell like a bomb on the table. Mrs. Anderson's eyes narrowed dangerously, but before she could respond, Michael stood and extended his hand to Emily. "It's been a long day for both of us," he said firmly. "It's time to go home." In the taxi back, Emily didn't know what to say. Michael looked out the window, his profile outlined against the nightlights of New York, his jaw tense, revealing the inner storm that contrasted with the apparent calm with which he had handled the situation. When they arrived at the penthouse, Emily finally broke the silence. "You didn't have to do that," she murmured. "It was your family." Michael turned to her, and there was something new in his gaze, an intensity that left her breathless. "No one has the right to treat you that way," he said with conviction. "Not even my mother, especially considering what you're sacrificing." "It's not a sacrifice," she replied before she could contain herself. "Not when it's saving my father's life." Michael then came closer, reducing the distance between them until Emily could perceive the subtle scent of sandalwood from his aftershave. "There's something you should know about me," he said, with a vulnerability he had never before shown. "I didn't grow up in all this. My father was a mechanic in Queens. I built my company from scratch, with loans and working 18 hours a day. My mother, she adapted too well to the new social position. Sometimes I think she forgot where we came from." The revelation hit Emily hard. He wasn't the privileged from birth that she had imagined, but someone who, like her, knew the value of effort and sacrifice. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked softly. Michael smiled, a sad smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Because I want you to understand that I see beyond contracts and agreements. I see a woman willing to do anything for her family, and that I deeply respect." That night, as Emily contemplated the ceiling of her room, she felt that something fundamental had changed between them. They were no longer simply two strangers united by a contract. Something more had emerged, fragile and nameless, but undeniably present. Perhaps, she thought as sleep claimed her, true connections between people are born precisely in those moments when we defend the dignity of the other, even when no one expects it, especially when it has a personal cost. The day Emily discovered the real reason why Michael didn't sleep began with a muffled scream that woke her in the middle of the night. She left her room barefoot, following the sound to the door of his bedroom. She hesitated for an instant, but the anguish she perceived on the other side made up her mind. She found him sitting on the bed, his bare torso pearled with sweat and his breathing broken, as if he had run a marathon. His eyes, usually confident and calculating, were wide open with a vulnerability that broke something inside Emily. "Michael," she whispered from the doorway. "Are you all right?" He looked up, disoriented for a moment, as if he didn't recognize her. Then consciousness returned to his eyes, along with shame. "I'm sorry," he murmured, passing a hand over his face. "I didn't want to wake you." Emily approached cautiously and sat on the edge of the bed, at a prudent distance. "Do you want to talk about it?" she offered. Michael shook his head, but after a long silence the words began to flow, first in a thread of voice, and then with more firmness, as if a long-contained dam had finally broken. He told her about his first fiancée, a woman named Sarah who died in a car accident when Michael was 25, just a week before their wedding. He spoke of the nightmares, of how he still sometimes heard the phone ringing with that terrible news, of how he had built walls around himself to never feel that vulnerable again. "In business," he said bitterly, "no one respects those who come from below. I had to learn to be tougher, colder, more calculating than all of them. To never show weakness. But you're not really like that," murmured Emily, finally understanding the man behind the facade. Michael looked at her with a mixture of surprise and something like fear, as if she had seen through armor he believed impenetrable. "How can you know? You barely know me." Emily smiled softly. "I've seen you with the building employees. You always know their names and ask about their families. I've seen how you treat the cleaning lady, with more respect than many show to their equals. I saw how you behaved at the hospital with my father, as if you truly cared." The silence that followed was charged with a new intimacy, different from anything they had shared before. Without thinking, Emily extended her hand and touched his, a simple gesture of human comfort. What she didn't expect was for Michael to intertwine his fingers with hers, like a castaway clinging to a lifeline. "When I was 25, he said in a hoarse voice, "I was engaged. Her name was Sarah. She died in a car accident, a week before the wedding." The revelation fell like lightning in the quietness of the room. Suddenly, so many things made sense. Michael's self-imposed solitude, the coldness with which he treated romantic matters, the nightmares. "I'm so sorry," whispered Emily, squeezing his hand more tightly. "It was a long time ago," he replied, but the pain in his voice belied his words. "But since then, every time I try to sleep, I go back to receiving that call. I go back to feeling the world crumble. That's why I prefer not to sleep." In an impulse she didn't stop to analyze, Emily moved closer and hugged him. It was an awkward, unexpected embrace, but full of an empathy that transcended the limits of their agreement. At first Michael remained rigid, as if he had forgotten how to respond to human contact. But slowly his arms surrounded her, and his head descended to rest on her shoulder. They remained like that, in silence, while the night of New York throbbed on the other side of the windows, and the world kept turning, indifferent to the small but significant connection that was forming in that bedroom in Penumbra. "Stay," he whispered against her hair. "Just for tonight. Just to sleep." And so Emily lay down next to Michael, on top of the sheets, with a prudent distance between them that shortened as sleep claimed them. The last thing she would remember upon waking would be the warmth of a protective arm around her waist, and the rhythmic breathing of someone who, for the first time in years, slept without nightmares. At dawn, when the first rays of sun began to filter through the half-open blinds, Emily woke to find Michael observing her with an indecipherable expression. "Good morning," she murmured, suddenly aware of the intimacy of the situation. "Good morning," he replied, his voice still rough from sleep. "It's been years since I slept like that." There was a vulnerability in his confession that made Emily's heart beat faster. For a moment time seemed suspended as they looked at each other, something new and unspoken floating in the air between them. Then Michael's phone rang, breaking the spell. It was a work call, urgent and unavoidable. When he finished, the businessman's mask was back in place. "I have to go," he said, getting up. "There's a crisis with a project in Boston." Emily nodded, trying to ignore the pang of disappointment. "I understand." Michael stopped at the bathroom door as if he wanted to say something more, but finally just nodded. "Thank you," he said simply, and in that single word was a universe of meanings that neither was ready to explore yet. Sometimes, thought Emily as she returned to her own room, true human connections are born not from great romantic gestures, but from those moments of pure vulnerability in which we allow someone else to see our scars without feeling the need to cover or explain them. What neither knew was that that night had irrevocably changed the course of their agreement, slowly transforming a contract into something that no legal document could ever contain. The change wasn't sudden but gradual, like the arrival of dawn. Small everyday gestures that began to weave an intimacy that transcended the paper signed 4 months ago. Michael started arriving home from work earlier. Emily began waiting for him for dinner. The silent dinners transformed into conversations that extended into the early hours, discovering unexpected coincidences and differences that, surprisingly, complemented each other. The invisible barrier between their rooms remained, but something had fundamentally changed in their relationship. They were no longer two strangers pretending a marriage. They were two people discovering, with caution and wonder, that perhaps they could build something real from the artificial. It was in this atmosphere of change that the invitation arrived that would alter everything. "I want you to accompany me to San Francisco this weekend," Michael said one night, as they shared a wine on the spacious balcony of the penthouse. "I have an important meeting there, but I thought we could stay a few more days to explore the city." It wasn't the first time Emily had accompanied him to a business event, but they had always been day trips, returning the same night. Never a trip of several days. Never something that sounded so much like shared vacation. "Are you sure?" she asked, trying to keep her voice from revealing the mixture of excitement and fear she felt. "I wouldn't want to distract you from your work." Michael looked at her directly, with that intensity that still disconcerted her. "I'm sure," he replied simply. "I think a change of scenery would do us good." Sometimes the most significant decisions don't seem important when we make them. It's only later, looking back, that we see the exact moment our path changed forever, thought Emily as she packed her suitcase, her hands trembling slightly at the unknown that lay ahead. San Francisco welcomed them with an embrace of golden light and warmth perfumed with sea breeze. Michael's business meeting went smoothly, and soon they found themselves free to explore the city like any vacationing couple. They walked along the Embarcadero, where the blue turquoise bay broke in foamy waves against the piers. They visited the imposing Golden Gate Bridge and rode the cable cars, from where the city stretched like a watercolor of blues, greens, and terracotta. They shared tapas in small bars where the wine flowed, and laughter was contagious. To anyone watching them, they were simply a couple in love enjoying the romantic city by the bay. But for them, each shared moment, each glance held a second longer than necessary. Each accidental brush of hands was new and terrifying territory. The night that changed everything came after dinner at a restaurant overlooking the bay, where they had enjoyed the hypnotic view of Alcatraz at sunset. The hotel where they were staying, a former palace converted in Nob Hill, had a terrace with views of the illuminated Golden Gate Bridge and the bay that stretched majestically under the starry sky. There, under the spell of the San Francisco night, and perhaps with guards lowered by wine and sea air, Michael finally spoke of what they had been avoiding for weeks. "This isn't what we signed up for anymore, is it?" he said quietly, looking out at the city instead of at her, as if afraid of what he might find in her eyes. Emily felt her heart accelerate. It was true. What had begun as a practical agreement, a contract of convenience, had transformed into something neither had foreseen. "No," she answered honestly. "It isn't." Michael turned then to look at her, his face partially in shadow, but with a vulnerability so evident that Emily felt a lump in her throat. "I've spent 6 years just existing, not living," he confessed, his voice breaking slightly. "I built a castle of success to avoid facing loneliness. And then you came, with your ability to see beauty in the simplest things, with your way of making every space you occupy feel like a home." He took a step closer, reducing the distance between them. "But since you arrived, I began to remember what it's like to wake up wanting to live the day," he continued, with an honesty that seemed to cost him physical effort. "And that terrifies me." Emily remained still, paralyzed not by his words but by the resonance they found in her own heart. At some point in recent months, without realizing it, she had allowed this complicated, wounded, but fundamentally good man into her life in a way that went far beyond any contract. "It scares me too," she admitted in a whisper. "This wasn't in the plan." Michael smiled then, a sad but genuine smile. "The best moments of my life have never been in any plan." And then, with the Golden Gate Bridge as a silent witness, he made a decision that would change everything. With a gentleness that contrasted with his usual determination, he cradled Emily's face in his hands and kissed her. It wasn't like the chaste kiss of their wedding, that cold seal on a paper contract. This kiss contained questions and promises, fear and hope. It was the kiss of two people who, against all odds, had found something real in the artificial. When they finally separated with quickened breathing and bright eyes, Emily knew they had crossed a point of no return. The contract, the clauses, the agreed terms, all that now seemed to belong to another life, to other people. "I don't know what this means," murmured Michael, resting his forehead against hers. "I don't know how this works." Emily smiled, intertwining her fingers with his. "I don't either," she replied honestly. "But I think we could discover it together." That night, when they returned to their hotel room, there was no need for words. Their bodies spoke a language older than any contract, a language of desire and mutual discovery. And while the city slept under the starry mantle, two souls who had begun as strangers, united by convenience, found in each other's arms a home that neither knew they were looking for. "There are decisions," thought Emily as she fell asleep in Michael's arms, "that aren't made with the head but with the soul, and although they may seem imprudent in the light of reason, they contain a deeper wisdom than any logic could comprehend." What neither could foresee was that the true test of what they were building had barely begun. New York welcomed them with a leaden sky and a fine drizzle that seemed to warn that the San Francisco idyll had ended. As they crossed the threshold of the penthouse, Emily felt a subtle but undeniable change, as if the space they had previously only shared as roommates was now witness to an intimacy for which its walls weren't prepared. The first week after their return was a tentative dance, rediscovering themselves in this new context. Shared dinners now had a different meaning. Casual brushes in the kitchen awakened electric currents. Nights no longer found them in separate rooms, but intertwined in Michael's large bed, where his nightmares seemed to have given truce. "It's curious," reflected Emily one morning as she watched Michael sleep peacefully, "how we can sign contracts that claim to define our lives, when the heart always follows its own unwritten clauses. But the bubble of happiness wouldn't take long to encounter harsh reality. The first crack appeared in the form of a phone call. Emily was in the kitchen, preparing an apple pie, a recipe from her grandmother that had always given her trouble, when Michael's phone rang. He answered in his usual professional tone, but soon his expression transformed into a mask of tension. "I understand," he said after a long silence. "I'll be there in an hour." When he hung up, his gaze avoided Emily's. "Did something happen?" she asked, with flour on her hands and a cold premonition settling in her stomach. "It was my mother," he replied, his voice suddenly distant. "She wants to see me, alone." Emily nodded, trying to ignore the pang of unease. Since that disastrous dinner, Mrs. Anderson had remained distant, her disapproval manifesting in a glacial silence that in a way was worse than any open criticism. "Go," she said with a smile she hoped was reassuring. "The pie will be ready when you return." Michael approached and kissed her softly, but there was a tension in his shoulders that didn't go unnoticed by Emily. When the door closed behind him, the silence of the penthouse suddenly seemed oppressive. The hours passed. The pie cooled on the counter. The New York sky transitioned from grey to black, and Emily waited, with a knot of anxiety growing in her throat. When Michael finally returned past midnight, his face was an indecipherable mask. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, something he hadn't done since San Francisco, and sat in the dimness of the living room, contemplating the city lights with a lost gaze. "What happened?" asked Emily, sitting across from him, preparing for the worst. Michael took a long drink before responding. "My mother discovered the truth about our marriage," he said finally, each word heavy as lead. "Someone from the clinic where your father is told her about the sudden transfer and luxury treatments. She investigated and connected the dots." Emily felt the floor opening beneath her feet. Her greatest fear had always been that the truth would come to light, that the world would know she had sold herself to save her father. "And what did she say?" she managed to ask, though she feared the answer. Michael let out a bitter laugh, without humor. "That she always knew there was something suspicious about our union, that it was evident a woman like you could only be with a man like me for money." His jaw tensed. "And then she proceeded to detail all the ways this could ruin my reputation if it became public, how it would affect the company, our good name." Emily felt hot tears forming in her eyes, but she held them back fiercely. She wouldn't cry. Not over this. "And what did you answer?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Michael raised his gaze then, and there was a fierce determination in his eyes. "I told her I didn't care," he responded, "that what began as a contract has grown into something worth more than any reputation or fortune. I told her I love you, Emily." Time seemed to stop. Those 3 words, never before spoken between them, floated in the air like a promise, like a challenge to the world and to themselves. Emily felt her heart expanding painfully in her chest. "Do you mean it?" she asked, needing to be sure, needing to know it wasn't just a reaction to Mrs. Anderson's ultimatum. Michael set down the glass and approached her, taking her hands in his. "I've never said those words to anyone since Sarah," he confessed, his voice breaking slightly. "I didn't even believe I was capable of feeling them again. But then you came, with your apple pie that never turns out quite right," he smiled, pointing to the somewhat misshapen creation waiting in the kitchen. "With your way of singing when you think no one is listening, with your ability to see the good in me when I had forgotten it myself." He knelt before her, a gesture that completely surprised her. "I love you, Emily Parker," he said, with a firm voice that contrasted with the vulnerability in his eyes. "And if you feel the same, I want us to continue with this. Not for the contract, not for a year, but for as long as you'll have me." Emily felt that tears, now of a different emotion, were flowing freely down her cheeks. She had entered this marriage out of desperation, out of necessity, never imagining she would find in it not only her father's salvation, but her own. "I love you too," she replied, her voice small but certain. "And it scares me how much." Michael embraced her then, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world, and perhaps to him she was. That night, as the rain gently tapped on the penthouse windows, they made love with a new awareness, with the certainty that each caress, each sigh, each whispered promise was a brick in the edifice of something real they were building together. What they didn't know was that the storm was just beginning, and that their newly confessed love would face much tougher tests than Mrs. Anderson's disapproval. "True love," thought Emily as she fell asleep in Michael's arms, "isn't the one born in perfect circumstances, but the one that survives and flourishes despite all the reasons it would have to wither." The discovery occurred on a rainy Tuesday, 6 months after the wedding. Emily had gone to visit her family in Brooklyn, bringing prepared food for her father, who was now recovering favorably after the transplant. The joy of seeing him improve day by day was the only thing that compensated for the guilt that sometimes assailed her about the nature of her marriage. What she didn't expect was to find her Aunt Dorothy, always meddlesome and suspicious, waiting for her with an expression that mixed triumph and reproach. "I found this in your father's study," she said without preamble, holding a paper that Emily recognized immediately with growing horror. "I was looking for the insurance forms, and I came across this." It was a copy of the marriage contract, the document that clearly specified the terms of her union with Michael, the 1-year duration, the economic compensations, the irrefutable evidence that her marriage was nothing more than a commercial transaction. Or at least that's how it had begun. "Aunt, I can explain," Emily started, but the horrified expression of her mother, who had just entered the room, cut off her words. "What is this, Emily?" asked Susan, taking the document from Dorothy's hands with trembling fingers. "Did you sell yourself? For us?" Guilt, shame, and a deep pain mixed in Emily's chest. She had never wanted her parents to know the truth, especially now that everything had changed, that what she felt for Michael was real and deep. "It's not what it seems," she managed to say, but it sounded weak even to her own ears. Her father appeared then, leaning on a cane, his figure still fragile from the operation, but with an intact dignity that now seemed to be cracking as his eyes scanned the document. "You sold yourself for me?" he asked with a broken voice, tears welling in his tired eyes. "This man bought you?" "No, Dad, it's not like that." Emily approached desperately, trying to take his hands, but Robert withdrew them as if the contact burned. "I can't believe my daughter," he murmured, turning to hide his decomposed face. "I'd rather have died than see you do this." The words fell like a hammer on Emily. The silence that followed was only interrupted by her mother's muffled sobs and the metallic pinging of rain against the old building's gutters. "You must annul this contract immediately," declared Aunt Dorothy, her voice laden with indignation. "This family may be humble, but we have dignity." "I can't annul it," Emily replied, finding her voice. "And even if I could, I wouldn't." Everyone looked at her, dumbfounded. "It's true that in the beginning it was a contract," she continued, the words coming out hurried but sincere. "But now it's real. I love him, and he loves me." Her aunt's disbelieving laugh was like a slap. "Please, girl, a man like that doesn't love someone like you. He's using you, and when the contract ends, he'll discard you like—" "Enough!" Susan's voice, normally soft, cut through the air with unexpected authority. "You will not speak of my daughter that way." She approached Emily and, to everyone's surprise, took her face between her hands, roughened by years of domestic work. "Is it true?" she asked, searching in her daughter's eyes. "Do you truly love him?" Emily nodded, tears flowing freely down her cheeks. "And he loves me, Mom. I know it sounds impossible, but it's real." Susan embraced her then, holding her with a strength that contradicted her petite figure. "I believe you," she whispered in her ear. "You've always had good judgment about people." But Robert remained apart, his back rigid with pain and disappointment. The breach that had opened seemed impossible to close with words. Emily returned to the penthouse that night devastated, her eyes swollen from crying. Michael found her sitting in the darkness of the living room, contemplating the lights of New York with a lost gaze. When she finally managed to explain what had happened, she saw how Michael's face transformed with a determination she knew well. "I'll go talk to them," he said simply. "Tomorrow." "They won't understand," she replied, exhausted. "For them, this is degrading. They feel used, betrayed." Michael knelt before her, taking her hands in his. "Then we'll show them it's real." The next day, against all of Emily's expectations, Michael presented himself at the humble Brooklyn apartment, dressed not in one of his impeccable executive suits, but in jeans and a simple shirt. He carried a bag of fresh bagels and a humility in his posture that Emily had never seen him show in the business world. He sat at the small kitchen table, which smelled of freshly made coffee, and waited patiently until everyone was present. Then, with disarming honesty, he spoke. "Yes, our marriage began as an agreement," he admitted, looking directly at Robert. "But what wasn't in any contract was that I would fall in love with your daughter." He related then how, day by day, Emily's presence had transformed not just his house, but his entire life. How she had brought warmth to a space that for years had been just a cold refuge. How her laughter had begun to heal wounds he thought eternally open. "I love her," he said finally, with a simplicity that contained more truth than any elaborate declaration. "And I know I don't deserve her, that we come from different worlds, but I promise you, I will spend every day trying to be worthy of the gift that is having her in my life." A long silence followed his words. Finally, to everyone's surprise, it was Robert who spoke. "My daughter," he said with a broken but firm voice, "is worth more than all the money in the world." "I know," Michael responded without hesitation, "and that's why I feel like the luckiest man every time she chooses to stay with me, when she could have anyone." Robert studied him at length, as if trying to see through any facade. Then, in a gesture that seemed to cost him physical effort, he extended his hand. "If my daughter has chosen you," he said with dignity, "she must have seen something good in you." When Michael shook that calloused, working hand, so different from those he usually shook in his business, Emily felt an enormous weight lifting from her shoulders. The path wouldn't be easy, but at least now they could walk it in the light without secrets. It was Susan who broke the tension, standing decisively. "Well, since you're family," she said to Michael, "you can help me set the table. No one leaves without trying my pancakes." And so, in a small Brooklyn kitchen, with the sound of cheap plates and tentative conversations, a new chapter in their story began to be woven, one in which the boundaries between the contract and love, between their different worlds, began to blur. The hardest truths, thought Emily as she watched Michael awkwardly help her mother serve the food, are those that free us, even though the process hurts like opening a wound, because only when we are honest with those we love can we build something that endures beyond well-intentioned lies. What she didn't know was that the toughest test of their love was yet to come. The 8th month of their marriage brought an unexpected calm. The relationship with Emily's family had begun to heal. Visits to Brooklyn became habitual, and Robert had even accepted coming to the penthouse for a dinner where Michael, with more enthusiasm than skill, had attempted to cook a Thanksgiving dinner under Emily's direction. In the business world, Michael had begun to delegate more responsibilities, arriving home at reasonable hours, making plans for weekends that didn't involve reviewing contracts or attending emergency calls. It was as if he had finally remembered there was a life beyond work. Emily, for her part, had begun her education studies at Columbia University, discovering in the classrooms a passion that had slept for years while she worked to support her family. Michael had converted a room in the penthouse into a study for her, with bookshelves full of books and a desk facing the window with a view of Central Park. "It's strange," reflected Emily one afternoon while studying for an exam, "how happiness can arrive so quietly, settling in the small, everyday moments, until one day you wake up and realize you no longer remember what life was like before." It was in the midst of this calm that Emily accidentally discovered Michael's secret. She was looking for a book in his office when, upon opening a drawer, she found an old photograph in a silver frame. Michael, evidently younger, smiled at the camera with a carefree happiness she had never seen in him. Next to him, a beautiful woman with dark hair and bright eyes returned his loving gaze. Turning over the frame, Emily found an inscription: "The Hamptons, 2019. My eternal love, Jessica." The date was just 6 years ago, long after Sarah, the fiancée Michael had lost and about whom he had spoken to her. This was another woman, another story he had never mentioned. When Michael arrived that night, he found Emily waiting in the living room, the photograph on the coffee table between them like a silent accusation. "Who is she?" she asked directly, her voice calm but firm. Michael froze at the sight of the image. For a moment it seemed he might avoid the question, but then his shoulders sagged slightly. "Jessica," he answered, sitting heavily on the sofa across from Emily. "My fiancée, or she was until 6 years ago." "You told me about Sarah," said Emily, trying to keep pain and confusion out of her voice. "You never mentioned anyone else." Michael passed a hand over his face, suddenly exhausted. "Sarah was my first love, my most traumatic loss," he began. "But Jessica was my second chance. We met at a conference in Chicago. She was an architect, brilliant, passionate. We fell in love quickly, intensely." He paused, his eyes fixed on the photograph. "I proposed after a year together. She accepted. Everything seemed perfect." "What happened?" Emily asked, though a part of her feared the answer. "She left me," he replied, with a simplicity that didn't hide the pain. "On our wedding day. She discovered I had hidden how badly I was doing financially at that time, building the company. I had presented myself as more successful than I was, fearing she would reject me if she knew my difficulties. She felt betrayed by the lie and left. She went to Italy, refusing to see me again. The silence that followed weighed with all the unspoken implications. Emily then understood so many things. Michael's initial reluctance to become emotionally involved, his obsession with work, his need to build an empire as a shield against rejection. Do you still love her? The question came out before she could contain it, loaded with a fear she didn't know she harbored. Michael raised his gaze, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that left her breathless. No, he answered firmly. I loved the person I thought she was, but now I understand she never really knew me. Not like you do. He came closer then, taking Emily's hands in his. You met me at my worst, Emily. You saw through my defenses, my coldness, my fears. You accepted me not for what I had, but for who I am. Emily wanted to believe him. She really did. But the insecurity, that old voice that had always whispered she wasn't enough, that they belonged to different worlds, now seemed to scream with renewed strength. What if I'm just a replacement? She asked, giving voice to her deepest fear. A way to prove you can build something after her? Michael looked at her as if she had slapped him. How can you think that? His voice broke. I love you, like I never thought I could love anyone. What I feel for you makes what I felt for Jessica seem like a pale sketch of what true love is. Emily wanted to believe him. She really did. But the photograph between them, that tangible reminder of a woman who had been so important that Michael still kept her image, sowed a seed of doubt she couldn't ignore. I need time, she said finally, standing up, to process this. That night, for the first time since San Francisco, they slept in separate rooms. Emily in her old room, staring at the ceiling while tears silently rolled down her cheeks. Michael, in his now too large and empty bed, contemplating the night city with eyes that saw nothing but his own fear of losing, again, what he valued most. The next morning, Emily found the door to the office open. Upon entering, she saw that the drawer where the photograph had been was open and empty. In the trash, the silver frame lay broken, the image gone. A clear message, but insufficient to heal the fracture that had opened between them. Sometimes, Emily thought as she closed the office door, the hardest ghosts to exorcise aren't those we lost, but those who voluntarily abandoned us, leaving us with the eternal question of whether we were enough. What she didn't know was that Ghost was about to materialize in the most unexpected and painful way possible. The call came 3 weeks after the discovery of the photograph. Emily and Michael had returned to sharing a bedroom, but there was a new fragility in their relationship, as if they both walked on thin ice, fearful that a wrong word could fracture everything. They were dining in silence when Michael's phone rang. Seeing the name on the screen, his face visibly paled. "It's my mother," he said, before standing to answer in private. When he returned minutes later, the tension in his jaw was evident. "She wants us to dine with her tomorrow," he informed in a controlled voice. "She says it's important that she has something to discuss about the future of the family business." Emily nodded, though a cold premonition settled in her stomach. Dinners with Mrs. Anderson were always tests of emotional endurance, but something in Michael's expression suggested this one would be particularly difficult. The restaurant chosen for the occasion was a discreet but luxurious establishment near Fifth Avenue. Upon entering, Emily immediately felt something didn't fit. The reserved table wasn't for 2 or 3 people, but for 4. "Who else is coming?" she asked Michael, who seemed as disconcerted as she was. The answer came in the form of Mrs. Anderson, impeccably dressed as always, but with a smile of satisfaction that never boded well. And beside her, an elegant woman with dark hair and penetrating eyes whom Emily recognized immediately, though she had only seen her in a photograph. Jessica. "Michael, darling," Mrs. Anderson greeted, kissing her son on both cheeks while deliberately ignoring Emily. "Look who's returned from Milan. Jessica has been asking about you." The world seemed to stop. Emily observed how Michael became completely still, his face an impenetrable mask that only she, who had learned to read each micro-expression, could see was full of shock. "Jessica," he finally said, his voice controlled. "It's been a long time." The woman smiled, a smile that didn't reach her eyes, and extended a perfectly manicured hand toward him. "Too long, I'd say," she responded with a melodious voice that contrasted with the coldness in her gaze. 6 years of regret. Emily felt she couldn't breathe. Mrs. Anderson's intention was transparent: to reunite her son with his former fiancée, the woman who, in her mind, truly belonged in his world, to erase the mistake she considered this marriage. The dinner that followed was an elaborate torture. Mrs. Anderson directed the conversation with the precision of a surgeon, highlighting the old times shared between Jessica and Michael, the common social circles, the friends who missed seeing them together. Jessica, for her part, played her role perfectly, alternating between nostalgic glances toward Michael and subtly condescending comments toward Emily. "And you say you're studying to be a teacher?" she asked with fake interest. "How vocational. I've always admired those who dedicate their lives to others without worrying about recognition or remuneration." Emily maintained her composure, smiling politely, while feeling that each word was a small dagger. "The real value is in forming the minds of the future," she responded with a dignity that surprised even Mrs. Anderson. "Though I understand not everyone can appreciate that kind of wealth." But the real blow came when Jessica, apparently repentant, began her rehearsed speech. "Michael, I know I hurt you," she said, her voice breaking perfectly at the right moments. "I got scared. I was young and immature. I didn't understand that what mattered wasn't your financial situation, but what we felt for each other." She extended her hand across the table, brushing his fingers in a gesture that seemed intimate and familiar. "I've spent 6 years regretting my mistake, trying to find in others what only you gave me. And now that I'm back, I wonder if we could talk, really talk, about what was, what could have been, what perhaps still could be." Emily felt her heart stop. She looked at Michael, waiting, needing him to reject this advance, to reaffirm what they had built together. But he was looking at Jessica with an indecipherable expression, something between surprise, caution, and nostalgia. For a terrible instant, Emily saw doubt in his eyes, the hesitation of a man confronted with the ghost of an unresolved love, a wound that had never completely healed. And it was then that she understood she couldn't bear it anymore. She couldn't stay there, watching as the past threatened to undo everything she believed real and solid. Without a word, she rose from the table and left the restaurant. The tears she had contained all night began to fall freely as she walked aimlessly through the illuminated streets of New York, her heart beating with a physical pain. "Perhaps," she thought, as the cold October wind dried her tears, "I always knew this was temporary, that it couldn't last, that we didn't belong in the same world." She returned to the penthouse with the firm intention of packing her bags and leaving before Michael returned. Before facing the rejection, the choice she feared he had already made, she was in the bedroom putting clothes in a suitcase with frantic movements when she heard the main door open and close. Hurried footsteps traversed the hallway, and then Michael appeared in the doorway, breathless as if he had run up the stairs instead of using the elevator. "What are you doing?" he asked, though the answer was evident. "I'm leaving," Emily replied, not stopping her movements. "Before you have to ask me to." "Ask you to?" The confusion in his voice seemed genuine. "Why would I ask you to leave?" Emily turned then, facing him with eyes bright with contained tears. "Because she's back. Because she's offering you a second chance with the love you lost. Because your mother made it very clear that it's she who really belongs by your side, not me." Michael crossed the room in 2 strides, taking the suitcase from her hands and throwing it aside. "No," he said with a firmness that surprised her. "Don't you dare leave. Not when I've finally found the courage for this." And then, to Emily's absolute perplexity, he knelt before her. Without an elaborate ring, without perfect planning, just a broken man asking for another chance from the woman who had taught him to love again. "Would you marry me for real?" he asked, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Not for a year, not for a contract. Forever." Emily stood motionless, unable to process what was happening. "But Jessica," she managed to articulate, "you looked at her as if—" "I looked at her like someone looking at a ghost," he interrupted. "Like someone who finally understands that what they thought they loved was just an illusion. I listened to her speak and didn't recognize the woman I thought was the love of my life. All I could think about was you, how you were feeling hearing her, how much I wanted to leave there with you." He stood then, taking Emily's hands in his. "I said no to her," he continued, "in front of my mother, in front of her. I told them I had found something real, something no shared past or family approval could equal. I told them, I love you, Emily. Only you. Tears were now flowing freely down both their cheeks. Emily felt her heart could explode with joy and fear in equal parts. Are you sure? She asked, needing that final confirmation. You won't regret it? Michael smiled, a smile that lit up his eyes in a way Emily had never seen, not even in that photograph with Jessica. The only regret I would have would be letting you go, he replied. So, Emily Parker, would you do me the honor of marrying me? This time for the right reasons. And there in the middle of a half-undone room, with an overturned suitcase and her heart beating as if it wanted to escape her chest, Emily took the most important leap of faith in her life. Yes, she answered simply, because sometimes the deepest truths need no more than a word. Perhaps, she thought as Michael held her in his arms as if he never wanted to let her go. True love isn't the one that comes without obstacles, but the one that chooses to move forward despite them, the one that looks fear in the eyes and decides each day that what is built together is worth more than any ghost from the past. What she didn't know was that this moment, this whispered yes amid tears and smiles, would mark the beginning of a new chapter in their story, one that no contract could have foreseen. Charleston, South Carolina, the historic city perched on its millennial rock, welcomed them with a perfect November day. The autumn sun bathed the ancient stones with a golden light that seemed to bless every corner of the colonial city. Emily observed the landscape from the car window, marveling at how life could change so completely in such a short time. They had chosen the small St. Michael's Church for the ceremony, a secluded place with panoramic views of the harbor and the colonial city. It wouldn't be an ostentatious wedding as Michael's social position demanded, but an intimate, honest celebration with only those who truly mattered. Second chances, reflected Emily as the car ascended the winding path to the church, don't always come as we expect. Sometimes they arrive disguised, hidden in the most difficult trials, revealing themselves only when we are willing to fight for what we truly value. The interior of the church was decorated with simplicity, wildflowers in vases of Carolina pottery, candles that projected dancing shadows on the walls of century-old stone, and a scent of lavender that evoked the summers of Emily's childhood in Virginia. Her dress, unlike the elegant high-fashion design of her first wedding, was a simple creation of raw silk that enhanced her natural beauty. She had insisted on buying it herself, with her first salary as a trainee teacher. It was important to her that this time each detail represent a conscious choice, not an imposition. When the soft music began to play, Emily walked down the aisle on her father's arm. Robert, now fully recovered, looked at her with eyes bright with pride. At the end of the aisle waited Michael, not with the formal and distant suit of their first ceremony, but with a genuine smile that illuminated his entire face. The guests were few but significant. Emily's family, some close friends they had made during these months, and surprisingly, Mrs. Anderson seated in the front row with an expression that mixed resignation and curiosity. The invitation to Michael's mother had been Emily's decision, a gesture of reconciliation that had left everyone surprised. "She's your mother," she had said to Michael when he protested. "Despite everything, she's family, and we're building bridges, not walls." The exchange of vows was simple but deeply moving. This time there were no rehearsed words or traditional formulas. They spoke from the heart, without filters or pretensions. "I found you when I wasn't looking for love," said Michael, his voice firm but laden with emotion. "When I believed that part of me had died. You taught me that true connection isn't built on expectations or appearances, but on shared truths, even the most difficult ones. I promise you honesty, respect, and the freedom to be exactly who you are. I promise to learn from my mistakes and grow together. But above all, I promise you love, not the idealized kind from fairy tales, but the real kind, imperfect, challenging, and more beautiful precisely because of that." Emily, with silent tears rolling down her cheeks, responded, "I entered your life for reasons that had nothing to do with love," she admitted in a soft voice. "And yet, love found me, found us, in the most unexpected place. You taught me that sometimes the strangest paths lead us exactly where we need to be. I promise patience when the past haunts you, strength when you doubt, and to remind you who you are when the world tries to change you. I promise to build with you a home, not of walls and ceilings, but of shared moments and mutual dreams. And above all, I choose you, today and every day. Not out of obligation, but for the privilege that is loving you. When the priest declared them husband and wife, the kiss they shared wasn't the superficial brush of their first ceremony, but a promise sealed with their entire being. The celebration that followed in a small restaurant with a terrace overlooking the harbour was intimate and joyful. To Emily's surprise, Mrs. Anderson approached her while Michael was talking with Robert about football, a topic that seemed to have created an unexpected bond between them. "I must admit, I was wrong about you," said the woman with a dignity that didn't entirely yield to humility. "I've never seen my son so complete, so at peace with himself." She extended a small blue velvet box. "It belonged to my grandmother," she explained, "a cameo brooch that has passed from generation to generation. Now it corresponds to you." Emily opened the box to find an exquisite piece of carved ivory, with delicate flowers and exotic birds, a work of art that told stories of other times. "It's beautiful," she murmured, genuinely moved by the gesture. "Thank you." Mrs. Anderson nodded slightly, a gesture that for her equaled surrender. "Take good care of him," she said, and Emily understood she wasn't just referring to the brooch. "He never knew how to protect himself from wounds." "I will," promised Emily, "with all my heart." As the afternoon gave way to evening, and the lights of Charleston began to twinkle like fallen stars, Emily and Michael found a moment alone on the terrace, contemplating the city that seemed suspended between heaven and earth. "You know what's strangest?" she murmured, leaning against his chest while he surrounded her with his arms. "That it all began with a contract, with terms and conditions, with deadlines." Michael rested his cheek against her hair, inhaling her jasmine scent. "And now we're here, without contracts, without deadlines," he responded. "Just two people choosing each day to build something together." Emily turned in his arms to look into his eyes. "Do you regret it?" she asked. "How it all began?" Michael gently shook his head. "How could I?" He smiled. "It brought us here. Sometimes the most unlikely beginnings lead to the most perfect destinations." As the sun hid behind the distant mountains, tinging the sky with orange and purple, they sealed this new promise with a kiss that tasted of future, of possibilities, of a love that had transcended all expectations. Perhaps, Ian thought Emily as they returned to the celebration, hand in hand, the bravest thing we can do isn't to leap without fear, but to leap despite it, to choose hope over certainty, possibility over security, and in that leap to discover we aren't falling, but flying. What neither knew then was that life still had one more surprise waiting for them, one that would complete their story in ways that not even the most detailed contract could have foreseen. The months that followed the renewal of their vows were of reconstruction and mutual discovery. The penthouse, previously a cold and minimalist space, began to transform into a true home. The white walls gradually covered with photographs of their trip to San Francisco, of the ceremony in Charleston, of everyday moments that would have previously seemed insignificant, but that they now treasured. One of the empty rooms became a library, with shelves that reached the ceiling and comfortable armchairs where Emily studied while Michael reviewed documents. They often worked in silence for hours, only interrupted by an occasional comment or a shared cup of tea, enjoying the simple presence of each other. Michael, to the surprise of everyone in his company, began to delegate more responsibilities, arriving home at reasonable hours and even taking entire weekends off. Emily had taught him, without even trying, that there was a life beyond work, that professional success without personal balance was an empty victory. On a rainy Sunday in January, while they were strolling through the Brooklyn flea market with no fixed destination, Michael stopped in front of a stall where an older man was selling rescued animals. "You always said you'd like to have a dog," he commented, pointing to a golden retriever who was watching them with sad eyes from a cage. "Are you sure?" Emily asked, surprised by the suggestion. "Our dog is a big responsibility, and with your schedule and my studies, we can make it work," he replied, with a decision that Emily had learned to recognize as irreversible. "Besides, look at him. He's choosing us." That same afternoon, Max, named after he immediately knocked over a vase trying to maximize his exploration of the penthouse, installed himself in the apartment, further transforming the home's dynamic. The dog, initially shy and frightened, began to flourish under the care of both, becoming a living symbol of the capacity to heal and trust again. "It's fascinating," thought Emily one night as she watched Michael sleeping next to Max, who had settled between them in the bed as if he had always belonged there. "How true love not only changes us, but transforms everything we touch. Spaces, routines, even time itself seems to flow differently." The relationship with both families also evolved. Sundays alternated between lunches in Brooklyn, where Michael had learned to play poker with Robert and the neighbors, and more formal but increasingly warm visits to Mrs. Anderson's house, who, to everyone's astonishment, had begun to genuinely ask about Emily's studies and show interest in her plans to work with disadvantaged children. It was during one of these family lunches in March when Emily began to suspect that something was changing in her body. Morning sickness, unusual fatigue, certain foods she previously enjoyed that now repulsed her. Signs that at first she attributed to the stress of final semester exams, but which gradually formed a pattern impossible to ignore. One afternoon after classes, she bought a pregnancy test at a pharmacy far from the neighborhood, wanting to keep the possibility secret until she was sure. In the penthouse bathroom, with trembling hands, she took the test and waited for the longest minutes of her life. When the positive result appeared, she remained motionless, unable to fully process what it meant. A baby, a life created between them, unplanned but now undeniably real. How would Michael react? They had never seriously talked about having children. Their relationship, which had begun in such an unconventional way, was just finding its balance. Were they prepared for this new challenge? That night, when he arrived from work, Emily had prepared a special dinner. Max, perceiving the tension in the environment, moved restlessly between them, as if trying to decipher what was happening. "Are we celebrating something?" asked Michael, noticing the special wine which she didn't touch and the candles on the table. "We could say so," Emily replied, trying to make her voice sound more confident than she felt. "I have something to tell you." For a moment she saw a flash of concern cross Michael's face, an echo of old fears of abandonment that had not yet completely healed. "I'm listening," he said, sitting across from her. Emily took a deep breath. "I'm pregnant," she announced, the words coming out more abruptly than she had planned. About 6 weeks along. The silence that followed seemed eternal. Michael stared at her, his face an indecipherable mask. For a terrible moment, Emily feared she had made a mistake, assumed too much, trusted prematurely in the solidity of what they had built. But then, to her complete surprise, she saw tears forming in Michael's eyes. Tears that began to slide down his cheeks, without him making any attempt to hide them. "We're going to have a child?" he asked in a broken voice, as if he needed confirmation that he hadn't heard wrong. Emily nodded, her own tears now mixing with his. "It wasn't planned," she said. "I know it's early, that it might not be the ideal time with my studies and your work, but—" She couldn't finish the sentence because Michael had stood up and was hugging her, lifting her from the chair in a gesture of pure joy that left her speechless. "It's perfect," he murmured against her hair. "You, me, Max, and now a baby. A real family. Something I never thought I could have." That night, embraced on the penthouse terrace, while they contemplated the lights of New York and Max slept peacefully at their feet, they made plans. They talked about how they would reorganize the rooms, possible names, how they would balance their careers with parenthood. "You know what's strangest?" said Michael, his hand resting protectively on Emily's still flat stomach. "A year ago, my life was perfect on paper. I had success, recognition, material wealth, and I was completely empty inside. And now?" she asked, though she believed she knew the answer. Michael smiled, kissing her forehead with a tenderness that still surprised her. "Now I have everything I never knew I needed. A woman who really sees me, not the CEO, not the good catch, but the imperfect and sometimes scared man that I am. A home that is more than luxurious walls." Perhaps, she thought as the stars twinkled over New York like silent witnesses to their dreams, the true magic isn't in getting exactly what we plan, but in discovering that what life brings us without warning can be infinitely more beautiful than anything we could have imagined. And so, under the night sky of the city that had been the setting for their improbable love story, Emily and Michael prepared for the next chapter, one that no contract had stipulated, but which, promised to be the most beautiful of all. And now a new life that will unite us forever, regardless of any contract. Emily intertwined her fingers with his, feeling how her heart expanded to accommodate this new joy, this unexpected but wonderfully welcome future. Exactly 1 year after that first night, Emily found herself again on the penthouse terrace, but everything had changed. Her belly, now visibly rounded by 4 months of pregnancy, harbored the promise of a new life. Max dozed at her feet, occasionally raising his head to sniff the spring air that brought aromas of flowers and possibilities. The penthouse had also evolved. The walls, once minimalist and cold, now displayed family photographs, bookshelves full of education books mixed with economic treatises, and in a room that had previously remained empty, a handcrafted wooden crib awaited its future occupant. Emily observed the dawn over New York, that magical hour when the city seemed suspended between dreams and reality. The same lights that a year ago had seemed distant and alien to her now felt familiar, almost intimate, as if the entire city were an extension of that home they had built together. She felt strong arms surrounding her from behind, a warm and comforting presence that had become her anchor in this new world. "Happy anniversary," murmured Michael against her hair, depositing a soft kiss on her temple. "1 year since we signed that contract." Emily smiled, leaning against him while their hands intertwined protectively over her belly. "Who would have imagined then where we would be today?" she replied, turning to look at him. Michael's face had changed in this year. The lines of tension that had previously permanently marked his forehead had softened. His eyes, once cautious and calculating, now showed a serenity that Emily would never have believed possible. "I have something for you," he said, taking an envelope from the pocket of his robe. Emily opened it curiously. Inside she found the original contract they had signed exactly a year ago, with all its clauses, terms, and conditions detailed in cold, impersonal legal language. "Why are you giving me this now?" she asked, disconcerted. Michael smiled, a smile that illuminated his entire face. "Because today it officially expires," he responded. "According to this document, our agreement ends exactly 1 year after signing. Today." Emily felt a lump in her throat, understanding the symbolic importance of the moment. "And what do we do with it?" she asked, holding the paper that had changed their lives in ways that neither could have anticipated. Michael took a lighter from his other pocket. "I thought we could give it a proper ending," he suggested. "Officially free our future from any connection to that beginning." In silence, Emily nodded. Together, in the center of that terrace that had been witness to so many crucial conversations, of so many moments of connection and mutual discovery, they lit a corner of the contract and let it burn slowly in a small terracotta brazier. As the flames consumed the paper, transforming into ashes what had once been a convenience agreement, Emily reflected on the extraordinary journey they had traveled, from strangers united by desperation and necessity to lovers united by a conscious choice and a love that had grown slowly, like a resistant plant that finds a way to flourish even in the most unlikely terrain. "Do you know what you did that first night that left me speechless?" she said, resuming a conversation they had had in San Francisco. "You gave me something that no one had ever given me. Choice, respect, the freedom to decide my own destiny. And it was precisely for that reason that I chose freely to love you." Michael looked at her as if he were memorizing every detail of her face, every nuance of this moment. "And I chose to love you," he replied. "Not because you were a convenient wife on paper, but because you showed me there is another way to live. One where success isn't measured in closed contracts or numbers in a bank account, but in shared moments, in unexpected laughter, in the ability to be vulnerable with another human being." The sun had fully risen over the New York horizon, bathing the terrace with a golden light that seemed to bless this new beginning. Of the contract, nothing remained but ashes, which the spring wind was already beginning to disperse. Emily took Michael's hand and placed it on her belly, just in time to feel a soft but unmistakable movement. "Did you feel that?" she asked, with eyes bright with emotion. Michael nodded, unable to speak for a moment, overwhelmed by the wonder of that new life they had created together. "That's our real contract," he finally said. "One that isn't written on paper but in the heart. One that doesn't have an expiration date." They kissed then under the rising sun of New York as the city awakened to a new day. A kiss that sealed not a commercial agreement, but a mutual promise to keep choosing each other every day, to build together a life that transcended any initial expectation. Contracts, thought Emily, as they separated with identical smiles of happiness, define obligations and deadlines, limits and conditions. But true love, that which is born from honesty and grows with mutual understanding, escapes any legal definition. It's the only commitment that, paradoxically, makes us more free. Max then rose, stretching lazily before approaching them, as if sensing it was time to join this family circle. Michael stooped to pet him, while Emily contemplated this domestic scene with a fullness she never would have believed possible a year ago when she signed that contract with trembling hands and an insecure heart. The penthouse, with its windows that embraced the New York horizon, was no longer the golden cage she had feared at the beginning. It had become the starting point of a much greater adventure, that of creating a family based not on obligations or appearances, but on conscious love and mutual respect. As the last ash of the contract vanished in the spring wind, Emily knew with certainty that what they had built together would endure much longer than any legal document, because some agreements don't need signatures or seals to be binding, just two hearts willing to risk everything for the possibility of finding in each other a home.